Welcome back, everyone, to the fourth and final Crime, Justice and Society seminar for the first semester. I am very pleased to be joined today by Deborah Russo, who is a PhD researcher here at the University of Edinburgh Law School. And she's joining us today to discuss her PhD research, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, which under the presentation title, Experiences of Isolation in Scottish Prisons Through a Letter Writing Project. This is going to be a standard setup today, so an hour and a half, 40 to 45 minutes presentation by Deborah, followed by a Q&A afterwards. That Q&A will not be recorded, as I said, so without further ado, I'll pass over to Deborah. Thank you very much, Deborah, for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Grant, and thank you to have given me the opportunity to talk to you all today about my research and how it's been progressing. So just to give you a bit of background, I started my PhD in September 2019 with an original focus on segregation in the Scottish prisons, namely concentrating on the original notion of segregation as a form of separation of prisoners for either administrative, protective, or disciplinary reasons, which in Scotland, it generally takes the form of separation in specific units known as separation and reintegration units, otherwise known as SRUs. Over the last few years, however, my PhD has evolved considerably and now centres more broadly on experiences of isolation in Scottish prisons through the qualitative means of the letter. Why the change from segregation to isolation and why the letter? I will be exploring these with you today and explaining why I've chosen this particular method. So my original research plan involved study of segregation in Scottish prisons with a comparator study of England and Ireland. And the starting point was the findings of the Committee for the Prevention of Torture following their visit to Scottish prisons. And it was a very damning report, particularly in relation to practices of segregation. And the focus of the research was going to be on accountability of decision-making, differences in practices amongst establishments, and alternatives to segregation practices. And my pre-COVID research methods would have involved an ethnographic fieldwork in segregation units in Scotland, coupled with semi-structured interviews with a sample of prisoners and officers from both male and female establishments, in order to allow the research to have a multidimensional approach. However, COVID hit us all and also hit my research. So I had to reconsider things a bit. Keramit Reiter is a prison researcher based in California, and she has done a lot of research in supermax prisons. And she maintains that prison research requires methodological creativity because of the constant access issues faced by researchers. So by March 2020, the first COVID lockdown had been imposed, resulting in my research plans grinding to a halt due to prison access for researchers being forbidden, at the time indefinitely. So around June 2000, approximately 3 months after the pandemic started, I modified my approach and decided that I could have proceed with the same research on segregation, but just needed to move to virtual interviews with retired Scottish Prison Service officials, coupled with interviews with released prisoners. And Reiter herself had done interviews with released prisoners as part and parcel of her research in supermax prisons, and all to take place virtually. I must admit, I didn't find the prospect of this particularly appealing, but this was a consideration that I made at my first year panel in order for the research to proceed. However, sometime in September 2020, it also became apparent that my research in its entirety would really be severely impacted by COVID, not just from an access point. And the principal reason being that as a result of COVID, isolation had really pervasively spread in prison settings, widening the disconnect and detachment between prisoners, families, and wider society. And this disconnect continues because whereas the rest of us have gone back to normal, prisons haven't. And this is a discussion for another day, but the reality faced by Scottish prisons now is that due to funding issues, the highest prison population in Western Europe and overcrowding, regimes in prisons are being managed through extremely limited purposeful activity and very long periods in cell, similarly to the COVID period. So I found myself in the unique position of having undertaken a PhD with a focus on segregation, and it would have felt like a missed opportunity if the consequences of COVID on prisoners had not been taken account as a part of it. And I also came to the realization that as researchers, we need to be able to adapt and report on things as we find them, not on what we wish to have found. And in this context, I could not therefore treat segregation in a vacuum. I could not make COVID go away when it had profoundly altered prisoners' experiences of isolation for the worst. So as a result, I had a shift in focus from segregation only to looking at practices involving segregation and isolation, including how these two concepts interrelate in carceral settings. So why the letter? So the letters mean a lot to prisoners because there's no internet in prisons. So prisoners' contact with the outside world often revolves around the receipt of letters, particularly when telephone PIN credit is low or physical visits are few and far between. Correspondence can be a lifeline for many prisoners. And letters features in almost every aspect of prisoners' lives. And countless books have been published featuring prisoners' writings. So if you think about Oscar Wilde and Nelson Mandela, just to name a few amongst the ones that I've cited. And as Marion Bannier, who's a prison researcher who undertook research by letter through correspondence with prisoners held on death row in California. She observes the argument that prisoners' letters can uncover hidden experiences of extreme penal severity further builds on a literature that regularly draws on inmates' written accounts. So the topic of my PhD shifted towards an exploration of isolation, and as a result of this, my methods too had to be reconsidered. And so my project evolved as COVID spread, and whereas my initial focus was solely to be on traditional forms of prisoners' segregation, my thoughts shifted as the pandemic progressed to consider segregation as a wider concept, more interlinked with isolation. And little did I know in the process that my method of inquiry would have been methodologically innovative, both in terms of the topic being researched, as well as in relation to the subject of the research. So what other means of research were available to me to allow me to grasp the essence of prisoners' experiences of isolation? And the letter emerged in a light bulb moment, really, and suddenly letter writing seemed an obvious choice. And ironically, the letter had been the principal means of communication between me and my clients when I was a prison lawyer in England for the best part of 15 years. So this means returned to me as perhaps the only viable qualitative means available at this particularly challenging time. And I wondered whether this means of communication could shift from the professional realm to a research context. And amidst a global pandemic, I did not have a wide selection of methods to choose from to capture prisoners' experiences of isolation. And I only had one option available, and that really is the one I chose. But looking into it from a kind of literature review perspective, it was a relatively new form of data collection, well suited for the pandemic, as Matt Maycock did some research on COVID and prisoners in Scotland. Marion Bannier had undertaken research with death row prisoners and kind of wrote an amazing article on the power of writing and prisoners. And Ryder herself, whom I mentioned previously, had used letters as part of a toolbox of methods. So it had been used before, perhaps not extensively, but it had been. And I also looked at the flexibility of letters. Could they provide a more flexible approach? So you could have different formats. You could exchange letters. It didn't have to be just one letter. You could have standard letters with semi-structured interviews type scenarios. or you could have a correspondence project over a lengthy period, for example. Seemed less rigid than an interview, with prisoners allowed time to articulate their answers, allowing the conversation to flow through letter writing, but also giving time to reflect between exchanges. So it gave a facility of reflection that perhaps is not so present in the context of the interview. So some advantages, as well as the ones I've just mentioned, include the fact that the therapeutic power of writing, which I'm going to discuss a bit later on, as prisoners have time to articulate their answers, they give rich and meaningful narratives. Letters provoke emotions, and as Jukes and Liebling have extensively researched this, emotions form an integral part of research, prison research. And also, the letter perhaps provided a more targeted approach in order to grasp the essence of an experience of isolation. And one thing I've found, which had already been identified by Matt Maycock, is the letters particularly well suited for exploring sensitive issues and the experience of kind of marginalized and vulnerable individuals such as prisoners, which I will also be talking about. However, there are some disadvantages that were identified in the literature, such as the fact that letters bar illiterate prisoners from sharing their experiences because prisoners' literacy levels are well below those in the general population, which results in an inevitable form of self-selection, which is undesirable but inescapable. And fellow prisoners are a lifeline for prisoners who find writing difficult. The other issues actually are also the fact that writing fixes words on paper and potentially also the construction of selves and others. However, looking at this more deeply, I actually looked at illiteracy in prison, and I found that in a way, the assessment of literacy is based on a comparison against the wider population, which, as Armstrong has observed, it potentially leads to a limiting and limited understanding of education. And I certainly found that my participants' difficulties in writing, and some of them did have difficulties, it did not bar them at all from communicating with me for a sustained period, far from it. A Freedom from Information Act request indicated that 70% of prisoners were at or below level 4 of the Scottish Credit Qualifications Framework, but this is not the same as saying they were all illiterate. And in some ways, counterintuitively, less fixation on punctuation and sentence structure could have added a degree of spontaneity that perhaps would have been lacking. And, And some other points about the disadvantages that I cited, the notion that writing fixes words and the degree of permanence of words on paper. Because my study was over a course of a year, as I will go on to explain, I was able to seek clarifications from my participants on issues that perhaps a single letter would have left some ambiguity on. So the potential inflexibility of written words on paper did not apply, in my view, to the same extent in my study. However, there are some risks associated to this choice of method. You don't know how many, I didn't know how many responses I would have received to the ad, how many prisoners I would have reached out to, could I reach out to different groups, how many participants would take part, and crucially, how many would have engaged for the length of the project. And would I have been able to extrapolate the same level of data as I would have done through interviews? So these were big questions, but because I didn't really have a choice, I just had to kind of dive in and see what would happen. So this is my story. This was the ad that I placed in the National Prison newspaper Inside Time last summer. No, not last summer. Yeah, summer, oh God, the years. 2021. Over the course of the summer, I put 2 ads in. And so I recruited 26 participants to engage in a correspondence project over a period of 12 months. 24, although 26 signed up, 24 in fact participated. 2 of them never actually started writing to me. So this is some just information, and I need to just thank Pablo, my PhD colleague. I know nothing about quantitative data, and he's helped me hugely with these tables. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Pablo for this. So table 1 represents, okay, I received about 162 letters to date over the course of a year. There's still a few, I'm finishing off a few things. So I think in the end, I'll probably have 170, 180 letters. And as you can see, with some of them I engaged, extensively, and they've written quite a lot of letters, but the average number of letters I received was about 6.79. So it's quite an extensive number of letters that I received throughout the project. And these tables show the participation until the end of the project. So, 70%, over 70% of prisoners participated until the end of the project, which I think is amazing, and I would never have expected. Wrongly, perhaps. Why shouldn't I have expected that? But I think the level of engagement was high, very high. And the reasons for ending the participation out of those 7, were real reasons, health or financial reasons, or the prisoners were released, which is a perfectly, good reason to end the project. And only in one case was it unclear why he stopped. So in terms of sex, there's mainly males, 1 trans female. The ages, I'm still obtaining information about the age because it's not something that I had explored so much, but I'm just sending my participants an end of project survey, and I'll ask about their ages then. And table 4 sets out the prisons where they're located. So majority are in Barlinnie and Glenorchy, a few in Edinburgh and Shotts, and a few others dotted around in other prisons. So table 5 shows the sentence type they're serving. So as you can see, a lot of them are serving long-term sentences, but quite a big number as well, 25% are on remand, probably due to the fact that there's so many remand prisoners in Scottish prisons. And below, there's offence type. I had not specifically asked my participants to share their offences with me, but they naturally, they came out. And those are the sort of offence types captured. So moving on, yes, so last tables to share. Quite interestingly, a high percentage of prisoners involved in the project are neurodiverse, 58%, and mental health issues reported, again, 58%. The 2 are not necessarily related, so I still need to try and capture the data, because it's not that all the neurodiverse people are also suffering from mental health issues. That's what I want to say, but I don't have the data for that yet. But it's quite a high number. And actually what I'm exploring, which I'm not going to discuss today, but it's probably for a different day, is the effect of neurodiversity on experiences of isolation, which is quite an interesting future finding. So just going back to the risky business and getting involved in letter writing, a good example of the risks involved in the chosen method are illustrated by the introduction of this statutory instrument, which was introduced a year ago. So in December 2021, the Scottish Prison Service introduced this SSI to the effect that any mail received by a prisoner would require photocopying prior to being handed over, due to the risk posed by psychoactive substances being impregnated on paper. So at the time, I asked myself whether the new SSI would have impacted my work, but concluded it wouldn't have, because as prisoners would continue to receive my letters, but just that the letters would be photocopied. What I had not anticipated was that the stamped self-addressed envelopes I included in all my correspondence with participants were also being photocopied, with the photocopy of the envelope being handed to prisoners rather than the original. Little thought is required to conclude that a photocopied SAE serves no purpose. Could I have foreseen this? No, absolutely not. Did it impact my research? Yes, of course. Some participants delayed their replies, writing daily for longer periods to maximize the use of second-class stamps they had paid for. And in the case of one participant, it is the one reason why he stopped corresponding with me, because he couldn't afford to pay for his own stamps. Due to this, I offered participants a £5 contribution to their cash accounts, which I will come back to you later, but I thought it would be worth just flagging now. So this is just to give you an example of how, one of the kind of hurdles of you can come across prison research generally, but with letters, who would have thought that this would have come about? So what has emerged throughout the project is the suitability of the method to the topic that was being studied. And isolation is a sensitive topic. And as Vanya observed in her research, the power of the pen lies in its capacity to create direct, intimate, emotive correspondence, unveiling, but also engaging the researcher in hidden experiences of our most severe penal practices. And prison research is sensitive per se. The study of deviance has generally been regarded as a sensitive topic. In the context of my research, both the object, isolation of the research, and the vulnerability of the subjects, the prisoners of the research, fall into the sensitive category. And sensitive aspects may arise at different points throughout the research. And they could be methodological, technical, ethical, political, or legal, as I will discuss later with one example. But what the letter has shown is that it's surprising permeability to the topic. And one of the reasons, I think, for this permeability of the letter is that the letter acts as a bridge. So Shabazz puts it beautifully when he says, prisoner writing is an attempt to carve out a place of humanity in a world not fit for humans, a place of freedom in an unfree world, an assertion of the right of the captive to be creative and expressive, to dream and to build bridges with the world beyond prison. So the letter provides distance from the institution itself, allowing analysis of prison from a wider perspective. As Armstrong and Jefferson have indicated, prison colonizes more than bodies and more than minds confined within its walls. It appropriates the outsider's very ability to imagine and critique it. So letter writing arguably gives researchers more space to imagine and critique, because we're not in prison, we're outside of prison, critiquing it through the receipt and through the correspondence. And in so doing, the letter transcends carceral space, because the letter moves from the prison to the outside world. And the epistolary experience is to Shabazz a spatial act, which allows prisoners themselves, as well as researchers, to make connections with others and to reimagine their relationship to the carceral world that holds them. And another aspect of the letter which I explored was, obviously I had to compare the letter to the interview. And at the beginning of the project, I was worried that the letter would not have been as complete form of inquiry as the interview. And it was a constant worry of mine. And thanks to the PhD, I was able to do a placement with the prison inspectorate. So, which has lasted quite some time. It's over a year now. And it has involved, so it's a review of segregation in Scottish prisons, and it has involved visiting all of Scotland's prisons and their segregation units, interviewing 70 people between prisoners and staff in all of those prisons. This, although unfortunately I have not been able to use that data as part of the PhD because the Scottish Prison Service has not agreed to that, it gave me an incredible experience in terms of interviewing in prisons. And I could see the limits of the interview, particularly in the context of the exploration of isolation. So in prison, there are time constraints. There's a question of trust. You're there for an hour. It's establishing a relationship of trust with a prisoner who is generally distrustful because of the nature of prison life with a stranger. It's quite difficult to establish that level of trust in an hour. And there's an obvious kind of hierarchy positioning between the participant and the researcher when the researcher goes into prison to interview. And there are power dynamics involved, and there's an unequal footing there. Whereas in the context of the correspondence project, I was able to really develop a depth of relationship over the course of a year, which is just not comparable to what I would have been able to achieve in an hour over an interview. The prisoners felt like they had a safe space to share their experiences. And the letter, as I will discuss, acts as a form of catharsis for prisoners. And just to touch upon catharsis, through writing, the participants were given the opportunity of retelling stories of trauma in a safe space, And in so doing, a process of catharsis happened. And I will read some quotes from some letters. So my participants have their own research names that they have chosen. So this is Rachel, and I will be talking about Rachel later, but Rachel says, in the time that I've been writing to you, explaining some things to you, telling you about myself, it has given me a small feeling of worth. For the first time in a long time, despite being in this pit surrounded by fruitcakes and junkies, I feel like I've helped someone. I always feel a bit emotional reading this, sorry, but I'm try my best not to burst into tears. I would like to thank you for that, Deborah. I would like to thank you for making me feel like a human being. The flip side to that, Deborah, I know that your work is nearly over, and I will no longer be your guinea pig. I feel sad about that. I have told you many things about myself: cross-dressing, vicious circle, Rachel, depression, and you have never judged me. You have always given me the opportunity to express myself in my letters, and I'm very grateful for that. And then Barry's an interesting character, because Barry is one of the most violent prisoners in Scotland, and he has spent an enormous amount of time, he's serving a life sentence, and he has spent a lot of time in segregation. So he wrote, I find writing very cathartic and helps me, as I have never discussed my time in segregation with anyone, not in any detail. Thanks again, as I do learn a lot about myself from your questions. You can go years in here with the same routine, and you never give much thought about any deep meaning to things. So it's good to step away from the normal routine of sport, gym, work, box sets. Since then, I try my best to avoid violence and better myself. I have given it a lot of thought, and I think it is maybe the action of writing it down that makes it real. The process of writing it down for me means I don't minimize what I've done, and on the other means I don't minimize how it has affected me. I don't know the turning point in making the decision to change. I would say dozens of individual things are all playing a part. And now I'm just going to read, going back to catharsis and what the project has meant to these prisoners. I mentioned that I made a £5 contribution to their prison cash accounts. So this was their response. So I was amazed, but out of 24 participants, I think 6 or 7 didn't want me to make the contribution, which I thought was incredible. So again, Rachel says, you said that you will make a £5 money contribution into my cash account. That is very nice of you, Deborah, but well, there are people in charities in this country in more need of the money than me. Besides, I enjoyed helping you. Really, if anything that I have told you will aid you in any way, then that is my reward. Jimmy says, Deborah, I will sign off for now, but before I go, I must address your very kind offer transferring £5 into my prison account. Your project has enabled me to address a very negative period in my life. So much so that being a small part in your journey to what I'm sure will be your eventual success with your PhD has transformed my thoughts to a reassured positive nature. That in itself is more reward than I could ever have expected. And then again, Barry, as for your offer to transfer £5, I appreciate the offer, but no thanks. Given the cost of living crisis, it's best you keep it. I couldn't believe it when I read that. So, you know, this goes to show what writing has meant to them. But this has come at a cost, also to me as a researcher, and this is something that I want to share with you that I've been giving it a lot of thought. You know, if I compare the interviews that I did across the prison estate, you know, you go into a prison, you interview, you leave the prison, you shut the door, you forget. The letters are always with me. I have them here, you know, in my drawer at home. They're always, you know, the letter comes and goes. I can never really shut the door. And so emotionally, it has been quite difficult. And, you know, I spent 15 years of my life as a prison lawyer, and I was receiving letters throughout all this time. And never once did I feel like I do now in terms of the emotional toll that these letters have had. And I think it's because of the nature of the topic, what I've shared and what the prisoners have shared with me over the course of this year. So I think there are emotional difficulties posed by the letter for the researcher, and I have found that more difficult to deal with. So I'll just mention the example of Rachel. So Rachel, I created a very close epistolary relationship with Rachel. You know, we've exchanged a lot of letters. She's a he identifies as a he. is a prisoner who's serving a long sentence. So, as I mentioned before, and as I quoted before, he cross-dresses. No one knows about this in prison. His secret name is Rachel. He cross-dresses, and he very shamefully, he's very ashamed of it, but the way he deals with isolation is through masturbation. But the real agonizing aspect of it is that he was abused as an 11-year-old by a female neighbor over the course of many months. And he relives this experience every time he's isolated. And reading through his letters time and time again has really made me realize how isolation re-traumatizes prisoners, because they relive traumatic experiences time and time again. And if you think about how long prisoners are isolated for, it is actually agonizing to think about. But I thought I'd share this with you. So, initial findings, well, I'm just exploring the data now, but one very interesting aspect about isolation is that it is pervasive and that prisoners experience it in many different scenarios in prison. So mostly in their own cell. Some of the prisoners experience it in the segregation unit if they are located in the segregation unit. They experience it when they're segregated in their own cell, which sometimes they are when they're not moved to a segregation unit, but they're kept for disciplinary reasons in their own cells, and they're not allowed to leave the prison, leave their cell. A lot of them experienced isolation due to COVID, 80%. Some of them experience isolation in transport. So they spend a lot of time being transported from prison to court dates, back and forth. Some of them have been driven from England. So you're talking hours and hours in a prison van. Sometimes, you know, if it's their first time in prison, they could be isolated for hours in a van on their own. And they have found this experience extremely isolating. Safe cells, meaning suicide prevention cells, a lot of them experience isolation in those types of cells, which is unsurprising. Some of my participants, as I mentioned, were on remand, and so they experience isolation, particularly on their first night in custody, 21%. 33% experience isolation even when cell sharing. Cell sharing is a very difficult experience for some of them, and they feel very isolated and alone even when sharing a space with someone else. And equally, particularly those prisoners who are neurodiverse experience isolation when they're alone with others. That's 25%. And so many reported back saying that to them, prison time is isolation. So 54% of prisoners, of my participants, have indicated that to them it's the time in prison that is isolating in and of itself. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have found it interesting, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Really, really enjoyed that.